Willkommen zu einer neuen Ausgabe von Kontext TV. In der heutigen Sendung
Welcome to Kontext TV. In our broadcast, we will be focusing on the poverty crisis in Africa. Poverty in Africa is already indicated by two figures. EU citizens earn 26 times more on average than citizens of African countries. The gross national product of the whole African continent is only 1/3 of the economic performance of Germany, although Africa has 12 times as many inhabitants as Germany, around 1 billion. The root causes for this inequality are manifold, reaching from European colonialism to the economic structural adjustment programs imposed by the International Monetary Fund since the 1980s. The situation in many African countries is currently exacerbated by what has become known as land grabbing, the massive buying up of land by foreign investors and by aggressive EU trade policies. But before we turn to these issues, we want to focus on the background of the revolutionary movements in North Africa. In the public debate, economic root causes for impoverishment and the resulting revolts are barely discussed yet. We talked to Michel Chossudovsky in Montreal, Canada, via video stream. Chossudovsky is Professor Emeritus at Ottawa University. He worked for the United Nations Development Programme and as a consultant for governments of developing countries around the world. He is now director of the Center for Research on Globalization. One of his best-known books is The Globalization of Poverty, Impacts of IMF and World Bank Reforms.
Welcome to Kontext TV, Mr. Chossudovsky. It's great to have you with us. Before we start, we would like to play a statement of Samir Amin of the Third World Forum in Dakar to you.
Since the beginning of Sadat, that is before Mubarak, Egypt have moved into accepting the so-called adjustment to the global system and the alignment on the US. And it is the World Bank, USAID, IMF, and so on, who have taken over dictating the economic policy of Egypt, which has been, as should have been accepted, should have been expected, a disaster in terms of social effects. Massive pauperization in already a country where the poor were poor. Massive accelerated expropriation of the small poor peasants. A massive unemployment and growing unemployment of even educated people. Massive deterioration of the conditions of the lower strata of the middle classes. All that massive. So that when it is being said by the World Bank that Egypt is doing not bad, 5% rate of growth, blah, 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 and that even giving it a certificate, it's coming close to be an emerging country, blah, 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 the people have not only not benefited, have been the victims of that. And therefore, there is absolutely no possibility, no alternative, but to say no to, and to decide independently of another policy, and to compel the global system to adjust and not the reverse.
Which role have the International Monetary Fund and other international organizations played in impoverishing North Africa?
The countries of North Africa have been subjected to the same IMF programs applied worldwide in countries across the globe, but essentially in developing countries. This is a standard set of measures which consists in destabilizing the national economy, opening it up to free trade. The important shift came at the height of the Gulf War, which involved the participation of Egypt in the war alongside several other Arab states. And one of the conditions of Egypt's participation was the cancellation of a rather sizable military debt with the United States, as well as the adoption of sweeping IMF reforms, which which in fact were imposed pretty much at the time of the Gulf War. I happened to be in Egypt at the very moment these reforms were being negotiated. In fact, I was a guest of the Ministry of Finance, and I spoke to people in the central bank, the Ministry of Finance. I met several of the ministers. I also addressed an audience of civil servants, advisors to the presidency, and the consensus was everybody was against this. I'm talking about the officials. Everybody was against this program at all levels of government, including the advisors to the presidency, in other words, Mubarak. And they said, we cannot do anything. Our hands are tied. So that, in effect, none of these people within the Mubarak government decide on anything. It is the foreign advisors, the people from the IMF, from the State Department. Decisions are not taken in Cairo, they're taken in Washington. And that those circumstances, from my standpoint, have, I think, reflect circumstances which prevailed in Egypt at the time, but which, again, prevail today. And the impacts of that program, that 1991 program, are devastating because, first of all, it was the first stage in the deregulation of food prices. From there on, the price of food started going up. It was heavily subsidized at the outset. The IMF and the World Bank are bureaucracies. I'm not suggesting that they necessarily call the shots, but they act on behalf of Wall Street. So we should, in fact, be describing this as the Wall Street consensus rather than the Washington consensus. But I should mention, and this is very important, the protest movement was not directed against the IMF and the United States and its interference in the affairs of the Egyptian state. In fact, quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. Why is it that the U.S. Embassy or the delegations of the European Union or the IMF and the World Bank were not the target of the protest movement? In other words, it was the replacement of an individual, of a president, of a puppet. It was not directed against the puppet masters, the people who pull the strings behind the scenes. So that this is a fundamental issue. That protest movement from the outset did not really address the main issue, which was the cause of impoverishment, namely the fact that foreign powers control the Egyptian state apparatus. And the reason for that is it may be based on a misunderstanding, but there were a number of opposition groups, civil society organizations, which are supported by U.S. foundations. We have evidence of high-level meetings between the opposition movements and Hillary Clinton, and previously with Condoleezza Rice. Why is it that they bring the representatives of the opposition party, opposition civil society groups to Washington to meet members of Congress, to meet the National Security Advisor, to meet with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and so on? It's obviously, it's clear that the United States wants to control the opposition, which may at some future date form a government. The April 6th movement, Kifaya, they're supported by U.S. foundations, and consequently their hands are tied when the issue of addressing the relationship of their country to U.S. To U.S. influence and U.S. demands, or the demands of international financial institutions and banks and so on. Well, that is something you don't talk about, and consequently, that protest movement now is in an impasse. I think that several of the leaders of that protest movement have in effect betrayed their grassroots. And now the protest movement is continuing and is addressing some of those issues, but it's no longer the object of media coverage, because now people are more concerned in ensuring that there will be some kind of meaningful change in the government of Egypt, rather than replacing one individual by another and maintaining the continuity of the military regime.
The US and EU are thinking about military intervention in Libya. Which interests are behind that?
I can assure you that this is not a humanitarian undertaking. It is part of what we would describe the battle for oil. It is intended to ultimately confiscate and take control of 3.5% of the world's oil and gas reserves, almost more than twice those of the United States of America. Libya is the largest oil economy in Africa. It has the highest reserves. It produces a large percentage of the oil requirements of the European Union, particularly France and Italy, and the objective or the hidden agenda of this proposed military intervention is ultimately to destabilize a government and to establish a framework whereby the National Oil Company of Libya, the National Oil Corporation, would be privatized, and eventually foreign companies would take control of Libya's oil wealth. That is the scenario. It's the same scenario as in Iraq, essentially, and it is using the pretext it's using a humanitarian pretext to implement a major military operation, which I think will have devastating consequences, not only for the Libyan people, but for the world as a whole. And why? Because at present we have three areas of conflict in the Middle East and Central Asia: Afghanistan, Iraq, and Palestine. If there is a military intervention in North Africa, this will lead to the creation of a fourth war theater with the possibility of escalation. The objectives of the United States are strategic. This is a country which has not been, until recently, under the brunt of IMF World Bank reforms.
Das war Michel Chossudovsky.
That was Michel Chossudovsky via video stream from Montreal, Canada. In Berlin, we talked to Mamdouh Habashi from the International Forum for Alternatives, Cairo, about the situation in Egypt and the perspectives for the democracy movements.
Die sehen auch die Demokratie als ein Mittel zum Ziel und nicht das Ziel, nämlich die wollen sofort etwas sehen, und ich sage sofort etwas sehen in Sachen Mindestlohn.
People in Egypt are looking at democracy as a means and not as a goal in itself. They immediately want to see improvements in terms of minimum wages, healthcare, education, housing, pensions, and so on. These are urgent demands. They have been urgent for years, becoming more and more crucial. And if there is no quick improvement for the large population, for the lowest strata of society, we are seriously in trouble. Democracy for us is not only elections. We understand democracy as a system leading also to social progress for the poor. Otherwise it is not a real democracy, but only a fake democracy, a democracy for corporations. And that is not the type of democracy we want to have.